Well, if all the political trends are to be believed, it looks like Republicans are going to have a very good day this upcoming election day in November, where it is almost certain that the Republicans will take back the House of Representatives. So what's going to happen as soon as that takes place? Will Democrats simply come out and go, you know what, gosh, I guess we just had fair and transparent elections and that's the or will we hear that due to a number of things from Vladimir Putin and probably most certainly because of gerrymandering, right? That will be the reason why Republicans won, according to Democrats. It will not be that Joe Biden was doing a horrible job or the economy was in the tank or he had screwed up Afghanistan or the Ukraine or what. No. It will be gerrymandering. And you're already starting to see some of this narrative take place now in order to prep the objective. Well, today we're going to go to our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines, who is actually going to explain what has been going on across the country. He's going to give a fair and honest analysis, and Republicans don't get off scot-free. But we're going to be talking about all of that and more on this episode of Making the Argument, where we make the arguments to defend a free society.
Thank you for joining us. If you learned something new today on this episode of Making the Argument, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe on YouTube and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. I can tell you that I am very excited for today's conversation. Gerrymandering and redistricting has been a conversation taking place within our team for many months now. And there are still questions that I have related to the topic, and I'm excited to ask those and learn more about the subject.
Well, I'm glad somebody's interested.
Well, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and actually had an opportunity to vote on what was the closest we could come up with a nonpartisan commission with respect to drawing the lines within the Commonwealth of Virginia. We'll discuss a little bit more of that. Not with me or any of us today is my beautiful wife, Queen of the Bees, Tina, because we're actually preparing to go on our anniversary, our 23rd anniversary. And so we're going to get...
Where y'all going?
We're gonna go down to Florida.
Nice.
Yeah,
Awesome.
well, you know, it's so we're gonna go down. We're gonna go down to Florida. We got some friends down there and whatnot. So we're gonna visit some friends, have a good time. But yeah, because of that, Queen of the Bees is not here today.
Okay.
But we do have, and again, the guy who's pretty much running the show today, biker gang member and political historian.
Yeah, this
Christian
is
Hines.
this is gonna be funny because it's almost like this was tailor-made for me.
Yeah, almost.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. We've had a couple episodes now that we're kind of like in the wheelhouse of certain people, so now we get to do mine.
Yeah, we get to do yours, and then of course, as always, we have our producer extraordinaire, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton.
It's a pleasure to be here. As always, Nick, let's get into it.
Okay, well, so again, as I said, this has been something where Christian is something of a subject matter expert. And I'm not just saying that because he likes to study it or he pulls up maps or he's constantly redrawing maps all over the country because he considers a really good time. That's right, ladies. If you were looking for a man...
They can gerrymander.
The nose had a gerrymander, right? This guy's single. So keep your calendars open. But no, this really is interesting. There's been a lot of times where Christian and I have talked about this, and he's put in a lot of time and effort. And like I said, when it comes to predicting election outcomes, these are the sort of things that he takes into consideration. So if you're wondering, as we go into this election cycle, if you are wondering, how are you going to combat this narrative, which will inevitably come? It is already starting, as you were about to see, that the only reason why Republicans won is because they cheated. Right, which I was told we're not allowed to say things like that. But apparently it's okay when the Democrats do it. Christian is about to give you all of the arguments that you need to be able to understand what is actually going on, what's been done, what's being done, and how it's going to affect the election cycle for 2022. Christian.
And for the next 10 years, actually.
Yeah, 10 years. 10 years.
Which kind of gets into, okay, so long story short, as most people know, every 10 years, there's a census that's done, right? So we just had one in 2020 that, determined the population of all the states and cities and counties and, everything in the country. Well, that census is used to then reappoint congressional seats to every single state in the country. There's 435 seats in the House of Representatives. We know there's 100 seats in the Senate because there's 50 states and there's 2 senators for every state. So in the House, it doesn't matter what happens with the state population. There's always 2 senators per state. That's enshrined in the Constitution. But the House is based on population, right? So every 10 years when the census is done and we re-update those numbers to figure out who's living where, those seats get reallocated to different states. So some states will lose seats if they're losing population or they're just not growing that fast. Some states will pick up seats if they're growing really rapidly, as we've seen in like Texas. I mean, Texas blew up over the last decade and the decade before that, actually. They picked up 4 seats in 2010, and they just picked up 2 seats this year. Florida picked up 1 seat this year as well. So, and then meanwhile, states like California lost a seat because we've talked about this before also on this podcast, there's a giant blue state exodus going on in California. So because California's losing population, they're going to lose a congressional seat. So basically, whenever the census is done every 10 years, those numbers are then sent to all the states, and then there's a formula that's used to calculate how many congressional districts each state gets. And then once that formula is done and each state is allocated their number of seats, then it's the responsibility of that state. And it depends on each state, the process that they use, and we'll get into that as well today. But each state then gets to choose how they're going to redraw their lines. And they have to redraw their lines, even if they're keeping the same number of districts, because every single district has to have the same number of people, and people shift around even within a state. So even if you're a state like, Arkansas, that didn't really pick up any seats, didn't really grow or shrink faster than the rest of the country, they still have 4 seats, just like they did in the last, cycle in 2010. They still have to redraw their lines to make sure that each district has the same number of people in it. So basically, that's what's going on. It's very technical, but it has a really massive impact for all of American politics for the next decade until, what will be the 2030 census. So what's happening now is, the thing that nerds, just geek out over, election nerds geek out over. But the general public will see the impact of it when they actually go to their ballot box and vote in November in the midterms. Because some people, if they're living in what used to be a competitive district, they might have a different member of Congress now, or they might be in a brand new district, or they might be in a district that doesn't even have an incumbent, or they might be in a district that, used to exist, last year, but got destroyed because their seat lost a congressional district. So everybody is going to be impacted in some way, with respect to who their representative is or what district they live in or what it looks like. The process of redistricting usually takes several months. The data was released to the states last year, and we're just now getting to the very end of it. It's over 40 states have finished it. Some states don't really have, much work to do because they only have a couple of seats. But the only really big states that are outstanding now are New York is the big one because the Supreme Court, the appellate court there just threw out the congressional map, and we'll talk about that today as well. Kansas, Missouri, and New Hampshire. Those are the only 4 states that are left to redistrict. And once those are done, every single state will have finished this process.
So our redistricting process here in Virginia has taken a matter of months. And I can remember that. Can you walk us through the process of start to beginning where Virginia has gone, from getting the census numbers to having maps in place? So
Virginia was interesting, and I might actually lean on Nick to explain a little bit more of this because he actually voted for some of the legislation that governs the way that we're doing it. But to give you a brief, 30-second summary, Virginia over the past few years passed not an independent, but more like a bipartisan redistricting commission, rather than have just the legislature draw the maps like you have in some of these other states. Instead, they were going to say, we're going to set up this commission, and it's supposed to be equal representation between Republicans and Democrats. They're going to sit down and draw the maps. They're going to give it to the legislature. If the legislature doesn't like it, then it'll go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will draw the maps. And that's basically the process that we went through, because when the commission met, the Democrats basically were sitting there insisting that, well, we want 7 seats in a state that only has 11 electoral votes. And Republicans naturally were not interested in doing that because a 7-4 map is absolutely biased towards Democrats. If you really want an equal map, you would have 5-5 and then 1 toss-up seat, or maybe 6-5, one way or the other. That'd be more equal. But there were some disputes over the way that happened, and it ended up going to the courts, and the courts picked 2 people to draw the lines. And when they finished doing that, the map became official, and we still found ourselves in the 7th district, although the 7th district no longer goes to Richmond. It's now going up to Prince William.
Well, the interesting part kind of in the history, too, of what was going on in the Virginia General Assembly is look, whenever somebody's in power, nobody wants to give up the power of drawing the lines, right? And so let's just be intellectually honest about all of this. If Republicans are in power, they want to draw good lines for Republicans. If Democrats are in power, they want to draw good lines for Democrats. The real question is how much of these other kind of rules or standards do we use when we're drawing it? And you're going to see some of the congressional districts that have been drawn in other states. I mean, it's ridiculous. There is nothing to justify the way that they did it. There was clearly no other motivation other than we're trying to save a particular seat for our party. And both parties do it, right? Both parties do it.
Yes.
The idea in Virginia is that, okay, because you got a lot of people, we want an independent commission. Please hear me when I say this. Hear me when I say this. There is no such thing, right? There is no such thing as an independent commission.
But what about California?
Yeah, exactly. California, where they basically a bunch of academics got together from really liberal universities and whatnot. There is no such thing as an independent commission, right? There is always going to be some degree, because either the independent commission was selected by politicians, right, or there was some other mechanism where the process can be manipulated. And so the real question is what sort of rules govern your actions? Is it an open and transparent process? And is there some sort of appeal process when something is totally egregious, right? That's about as good as you can get. And in Virginia, I don't think ours worked perfectly. I think there's still issues. But what we essentially said is we're going to be open and transparent about this process. So Republicans are going to pick some people. Democrats are going to pick some people. Courts are going to have some oversight. It's going to be a process where we take into account things like communities of interest. We take into account things like geographical boundaries that make sense. We're going to take into account local political boundaries, right? So don't split up local precincts or counties or city lines or town lines when you don't need to.
Yeah,
don't do things like that, right? So those are the sort of boundaries that we put in place. And again, the overall map that came out of Virginia, I'm not thrilled with it. I think there's some obvious things you can look at and say, okay, that's problematic. But you are not going to see in Virginia what you are seeing in some of these other states with respect to just horribly blatant gerrymandering.
Yeah. And I was right about to bring up.
But one other thing on this, by the way, when the Republicans controlled the House of Delegates and the Senate.
Oh, I know where the story's going.
Democrats fought tooth and nail. They had a bunch of nonpartisan groups that were coming in talking about, we need this independent redistricting reform. And, again, Republicans had said no. And then there was election where Democrats won a bunch of seats, but Republicans were still in control. And the legislation went through. It was kind of one of those, the voters have spoken. Legislation went through. And we said, okay, here's the legislation. Here's the part that we want. There was a compromise struck. And we voted on it. And we voted on it with almost complete Democrat concurrence. But because we are changing the way the Constitution works in Virginia, there has to be an election cycle in between. So it goes out to this referendum. So the legislature's got to vote on it once. Then there's an election cycle in between. They vote on it again. Then it goes out for a referendum for the people to vote on it. And here was the funny part is the same Democrats that have been telling us for years, we had to have this. It was absolutely necessary. You were a racist if you didn't vote for it. We voted for it. And then they had an election cycle and they won seats. Now, keep in mind, they won a majority in seats that they had been claiming were hopelessly gerrymandered to favor Republicans. There was no way the Republicans had just ripped them off. And they won a majority in the seats as they were drawn. Then they came back.
Actually, they redrew some of them.
Yeah, and over half of the same Democrats that had well over half of the same Democrats that had voted for the legislation the year before didn't want to vote for it that year.
Yep.
To send it back to the people of Virginia to be able to decide whether or not they wanted
some of the same people.
Yeah.
Because, there were some new people in because there was an election, right? But like some of the same people that were like the leading figures on the left advocating for this constitutional amendment when they weren't in power were the same ones trying to sabotage and kill the bill.
They got up there on the floor numerous times. You are a racist if you vote for this. The year before, you were a racist if you didn't vote for it. But now you're a racist if you do vote for it. Now, I want to say this. I think there were 7, possibly 8 Democrats that basically said, look, I promised my constituents I would vote for this, and I'm going to vote for it. They underwent a lot of pressure from their own party, and they stuck to their guns. And look, I'm not just saying that because I might like the way it came out. That was admirable because there was a lot of pressure on those people.
Due credit should be given to those Democrats. Credit should be given
when it's due, and that was a hard vote for some of them to take. They took it anyways. So we had the redistricting commission. That's where we're at right now.
So why would Republicans in Virginia be against the independent commission to start with?
Because it's not
There's
independent.
no such thing as independent commission.
That's why I described it as a bipartisan commission. That's a better way to describe it. So to give you an idea, California on paper has an independent commission, but they don't. If you actually look at the so in California, they supposedly have this like commission that draws the maps, and it's not supposed to be the lawmakers, none of the politicians. But the Democrats figured out how to basically rig the selection process for who's on the commission, because that's what's important. We're talking about something that is so like deep in the weeds of
Right.
politics that the average general voting public, rightfully so, doesn't have a whole lot of time to comb through maps
No.
and read, 100 pages of white papers for court notes on this sort of stuff. So the only people that are like deeply interested in this topic are the same people that have a vested interest in their party winning the seats. And so like in California, what happened is that the Democrats basically figured out a way to rig the selection process. So they had people on the commission that were ostensibly Republicans who had donated to Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign.
Wow.
By the way, one of those Republicans was from Berkeley.
Yeah, because So a Berkeley Republican that had donated to Elizabeth Warren, that's who's representing the Republicans
on the commission.
Yeah, on this independent
Very
commission.
Republican, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Oh,
and so like, and what's incredible is that political pundits and especially Democrats were like, this is democracy in action. This is the way it needs to be done. Of course, that's the way you think it needs to be done because you ended up producing a map. In California, there's 52 congressional seats. You know how many Republican-held districts that Donald Trump won that the commission drew on a map with 52 seats? They gave him 8 districts out of 52 in the whole entire state. So in a state that Donald Trump got 34% of the vote in, Republicans ended up getting something along the lines of like 15 to 18% of the seats.
Wow.
So California's map, if you're looking at like percentage of the vote that your Republican presidential nominee got versus percentage of the congressional seats that your party was being given, the gap between those two things in California was over 20 points to the left. So California's supposed nonpartisan independent redistricting commission actually produced statistically one of the most egregious gerrymanders in the entire country.
So that makes total sense why elected Republicans would be against the independent commission.
Well, yeah, and it's not necessarily that it should just be Republicans. It's the idea of understand where we use certain words are commonly used within political spheres because they know it's attractive. Right. But that's a messaging tactic. It's not an accurate reflection of what is going on. Right. An accurate reflection of what is going on is to say, look, there's going to be bias in this. What we're trying to do is put rules in place that make sense to everybody so that way, when that bias manifests itself in a very clear gerrymander, we can point to it and say, no, those lines are not contiguous. No, those lines are cutting a bunch of precincts that you shouldn't cut. No, those lines are breaking apart, communities of interest. When you have that, then you can have this process where we know we're not going to get anything perfect, but at least we have rules that we all understand.
Sure.
And so, I mean, Nick hit the nail on the head there in terms of like, people are going to want to gerrymander. It's about trying to restrict that with certain rules saying that, you can't cross geographic boundaries or you can't cross political boundaries. It has to be within the, you've got your left and right boundary of what you can do, and you can't operate outside of those two things. Now, as this process is going out, what you're seeing from a lot of these like prominent political figures that are looking at most of these states, because I said, every single state other than 4 have already finished this process, right? And so a lot of these political figures, mostly on Twitter, ironically enough, that have been following this process as long as I have, are now coming out there with these talking points trying to insinuate that, Republicans just rigged the system and Democrats are getting the short end of the stick. So I wanted to show this tweet from Dave Wasserman to give you an idea of how into this topic he is. He literally named his Twitter handle @redistrict. So this is a guy who writes for the Cook Political Report, well-respected political analysis. He has a very, very large following on Twitter among election nerds and politicos and whatnot. He's got over 500,000 followers on Twitter. And Dave Wasserman tweeted just a few days ago, shorter 2022 redistricting. It's permissible to brazenly gerrymander in some states, mostly red, but not in others, mostly blue. As long as that's true, you're not going to end up with a fair or equitable national House map. First off, who gets to define equitable? Yeah. I have a feeling that it's Democrats that get to define equitable. But more importantly, what he's referring to was a recent court ruling in New York that threw out what is, if any state can challenge New York for the title of most egregious can challenge California for the title of most egregious gerrymander, it is New York State. So Wasserman was pulling up this list of states that he was alleging were gerrymandered one way or another. And he was like, here's all the states that the Republicans gerrymandered in: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Utah. And then he claimed that Democrat gerrymanders were Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, and Rhode Island. And then he listed a whole bunch of states that have like court, commission maps. He was trying to insinuate that these were neutral. And he said Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, because the court ruling there overturned the Democrat gerrymander, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Washington State, and Wisconsin. Now, the problem with his analysis, where he's basically trying to say Republicans have gerrymandered in more states than Democrats. So the most obvious example of this that the left is pointing to further their argument that GOP gerrymandering is going to take over the House and it's against our democracy, they're constantly pointing to two states. They're pointing to Texas and they're pointing to Florida.
Yeah. Sounds convenient.
Yes, it does sound relatively convenient if you think about it. So
what would be his incentive to make it appear that there are more Republican states gerrymandering than Democrat?
Because Democrats are going to lose. I mean, that's, in my opinion.
Sure.
I think it's obvious, but other people disagree. On the right, I think it's because the left knows that they're about to lose, and they're trying to tee up an argument that they're going to use for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Now, the other argument that you can make, which is a very strong argument, is that this is going to be used to further the push for H.R. 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that's an either-or proposition.
And define it. Let's tell everybody what H.R. 1 is.
Nick, do you want to explain a little bit about what that was?
H.R. 1 was essentially a complete federal takeover of election law on a number of levels, to include requiring independent commission. Again, there's that word again, right? Independent commissions across the country in order to draw congressional lines, right? But it wasn't just that. I mean, this was it was
Didn't they try to abolish voter ID in that too?
They tried to abolish any voter ID laws. They also tried to come up with some sort of scheme where you could use tax dollars in order to provide campaign contributions. It was something crazy too. I want to say it was like in the millions of dollars that you could get. It was like publicly financed campaign elections.
So there was crazy.
It's absolutely
it was like a
nuts.
complete federal takeover of all elections.
It was, which has been horribly unconstitutional. I don't think this could have passed the court. Now, again, you have 4 members of the Supreme Court that probably would have voted for it just because they would like the outcome, not because it was constitutional. And they probably would have used the Voting Rights Act in the 60s as justification for that.
And you know what they would have also used? They would have used tweets from Dave Wasserman to justify it.
Yeah.
See, political experts from the Cook Political Report are even pointing out that gerrymandering is taking place in Florida and Texas.
They're going to use this to argue that the election was stolen from them, and it was stolen from them because of gerrymandering and because of voter ID laws. And this is why we need, more access to the booth. And this is why we need H.R. 1 to take the money out of politics. And it's,
well,
again,
I'm sure they'll say
the
that this will also protect representative democracy.
Oh, well, everything protects democracy they want, right?
Speaking of that stuff, the next story that I mean, we'll come back to the Wasserman thing because I'm going to break down some of the states that he's alleging are a Republican gerrymander versus some states that he was trying to insinuate weren't a gerrymander. But to give you an idea of the narrative that is already coming out there, not just from Wasserman, but from, like national outlets. So 538, run by Nate Silver. He was super famous for calling the 2012 election almost spot on. He's got his own prediction outlet that he created called 538. 538 is the number of electoral votes in the Electoral College, by the way. That's where he got the term from. Here's the story that he ran, the title of the narrative that he ran when Texas produced their congressional map. Texas may have the worst gerrymander in the country. So that is the headline that they do when Republicans draw maps in Texas. And I'm going to break down exactly how gerrymandered the Texan map is, by the way, because it is. I will admit that it is a Republican gerrymander. But the point is that it is not even holding a candle to what the Democrats have done in some of these other states. So to give you an idea of another one of the stories that 538 brought up, here's what they wrote about Florida's new map when this just came out a couple weeks ago. The extreme bias of Florida's new congressional map. And then they started the story with talking about how Ron DeSantis is going to campaign for president one day, about how he was able to own the libs by destroying Democrats in the state and ruthlessly gerrymandering in favor of Republicans. So, like, those are the sort of stories that, you know, outlets that are really big into politics, really big into this sort of topic, that cater to an audience like myself, talk about when they're discussing, you know, redistricting on the right.
I think it's interesting you use the phrase cater to yourself here, because when an article like this goes out on Facebook and you have a middle of the road individual who's not on the left or the right and very not involved in politics, they see this and think to themselves, well, Ron DeSantis could be doing a horrible thing for, you know, Florida.
Yeah.
If you don't have the background information behind these headlines, it looks terrible.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. The headline is what drives the whole story. Like, when you're running a story titled, you know, Texas might have the worst gerrymander in the country, or the extreme bias of Florida's new congressional map.
It makes Republicans in Texas appear to do anything they can to retain power.
Sinister, evil almost.
Well, can I say another thing with this? And I find this fascinating.
Sure.
Every time a Republican said anything about potential voter fraud, it was Republicans are radicalizing their base, and that's a threat to our democracy. But every time they try to suggest that the only reason you're losing elections is because evil Republicans have gerrymandered the entire congressional map, and that's why you're losing. Okay, both statements.
That's not radicalizing?
Both statements are theoretically completely undermining anyone's trust or faith in election outcomes. Why is one horrible radicalization of the base, while the other is, oh, well, we're just bringing up a legitimate concern about something that's actually... Yeah, voter fraud happens. It might not happen on the level that some people think it does, but it happens, and it's a legitimate concern and something we should address. Gerrymandering happens, and it's a legitimate concern and something we should bring up. The difference is that gerrymandering tends to help both parties at different levels depending on where you are in the country. Mm-hmm. And we have some we also have some objective standards whereby we can judge how bad a gerrymander is.
Yes, I ran a formula to actually determine, for some of these larger big states, Texas, Florida, Illinois.
When you say formula, what kind of data are you putting into that?
So I'll get into that in just a second. I wanted to illustrate, though, the difference between the narrative that the left is using to describe the congressional maps in Florida and Texas. Here's another one from North Carolina when the Republicans passed one. North Carolina Republicans passed a heavily skewed congressional map. How will the courts respond? Like, that's a given. Like, oh, Republicans passed a map in North Carolina, so we immediately need to go to the courts for it. Like that. So that's the sort of language that they're using to describe when Republicans are drawing maps. And in all of these states, admittedly, as I've said, and as I will demonstrate, Republicans have been gerrymandering in these states. But when you actually break down the numbers, it is a fraction of what Democrats are doing in their states. So this is what 538 said about New York's map. This is the congressional map that was just tossed out by the appellate court in New York. New York's gerrymander might change which party picks up seats in the midterms. So, on one hand, the extreme bias of Florida's congressional map. Texas might have the most extreme gerrymander in the entire country. And then on the other hand, New York's gerrymander might change which party picks up seats in the midterms. Of course it might change which party picks up seats in the midterms. So... now I want to show actually some of these maps. And this is going to get into the formula.
Anyone like 538 on the Republican side? No.
There is nobody. One day maybe I will do that. But
yeah.
We're looking for you to make that happen.
There needs to be reasonable cover, because every single one of these people that is covering elections, covering redistricting, covering national politics in general, it's an arm of the media, effectively. It's a specific arm of the media because it's talking about a specific topic, in this case, politics. You go on Twitter and the whole entire community is called election Twitter. I'm one of those people. I would say 80 to 85% of election Twitter are hardcore progressive Democrats. And the media outlets that are catering to those people are probably 95 to maybe 98% Democrats.
So you're saying that some of the headlines that we're reading are skewed towards that demographic on Twitter.
Not just Twitter, but Twitter is probably the best example that I can think of.
The people who are interested in elections, because I look at these headlines and think that they're strategically written for that person middle of the road.
They are, but the content within them is to reinforce the pre-existing bias
So it's
of
like
the people.
it's achieving two things at the same time.
Yes.
Somebody shares an article on Facebook, they read the headline, they say, "Oh my goodness, these Republicans in Texas are
and then
terrible
the hardcore
people."
politicos are looking at it and being like,
gotcha.
"See, I knew I was right."
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I just wanted to show like this is actually what is being shared right now. And by the way, these articles are probably going to be teed up to then be reshared in November when Republicans take back the House. People are going to go back and dig up articles from 6 or 7 months ago and say, "See, we called it. Texas was extreme gerrymander."
These are going to be the "See, I told you so" articles.
I find this posturing fascinating. It's honestly frustrating, but it's just so fascinating to me how there are different forces within politics, within political media, that are thinking so far ahead to set up their arguments months in advance as to why they lost the election, and they can blame it on the other party's gerrymandering.
If you think this is interesting, let's take a look at actually what some of these maps look like. So this is going into the formula that we were just briefly talking about that I worked up. So this is a map of the Illinois congressional district, which
This is my fave.
this is arguably the most extreme. You want to talk about extreme gerrymanders? This is arguably the most extreme gerrymander in the entire country right now. So Illinois has 17 congressional districts. They actually lost a seat, by the way, in the previous census that was done.
Because so many people moved out of the
So
state.
many people moved out of the state. It's, I mean, you know, it is what it is. I mean, they always say that Illinois' #1 export is people. But my father's actually from Illinois, so he's
Yeah?
proof of that. But
And where
so-
does he live?
he lives in South Carolina
Okay.
now. Yeah. So in Illinois, they've got 17 districts. The Democrats drew a map, and by the way, the color coding here represents how much to the left or right it leans. So the darker the shade of red or blue, the more Republican or Democrat it is. So you see Chicago up there with Lake Michigan in the northeastern part of the state. You see all the snake lines moving out of Chicago. What that is a clear example of Democrats taking the inner city of Chicago, which is like 90%, 80% Democrat, and dragging it out into the suburbs and rural areas in order to pick up more competitive ground or even Republican-leaning ground in order to maximize the number of Democrat districts. This is an act called cracking.
Correct.
So
Okay.
if you were to draw a fair map, you could probably squeeze 1 or 2 Republican-held seats into the Chicago suburbs.
Here,
But you have
take
0.
my mouse here, Christian.
Okay.
and-
But you have 0 in the Chicago suburbs because Democrats have drawn all of these suburban districts into inner city Chicago in
Okay.
order to maximize the number of Democrat-held seats. And you have this one district here that goes from the south side of Chicago to like rural countryside Illinois in order to make this a Democrat seat, because this is all Republican territory here, but it's this part that's very, very blue in the northern part of the district. So And there's other examples of this. When you look at like this 13th district, which goes from the east side of St. Louis on the Illinois side of the Missouri River all the way up north to like Springfield and beyond. I mean, they literally drew this connecting all these little tiny blue cities together with red countryside in between in order to make this a Democrat-held seat. So in the end, when you look at the partisan breakdown of Illinois, what happened is that Republicans are going to be given 3 seats in Illinois. They're going to be given the 12th, the 15th, and the 16th, and that is it. Democrats have done everything they can to maximize their strength in this state. And to give you an idea of how extreme this gerrymander is, Donald Trump won about 40% of the vote in Illinois in 2020. He lost the state. He lost the state in a big way.
Yeah.
He lost the state by 17 points. There's no way that realistically a fair map would produce a majority Republican, congressional delegation from Illinois. But it would produce more than 3 seats in a state that has 17. So to give you an idea of just how far to the left it is, the same party that got 40% of the vote in Illinois is being given 17% of the state's congressional seats. So the gap between the number of votes that Trump got versus the percentage of seats that Republicans are being given, that gap is 22 points to the left, which means that Illinois is tied with, well, now it's actually the leader because it was previously tied with New York for the most extreme left-wing gerrymander in the entire country. And New York's map was just thrown out by the courts. And when Democrats go back to Texas and they say that, Texas is an extreme Republican gerrymander, it's the most egregious gerrymander in the entire country. Texas has 38 congressional districts. Republicans control the whole thing. They did gerrymander. It has 38 congressional districts. When Republicans redrew the lines in Texas, they gave Democrats 13 seats that voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. It actually might have been 14 seats because there's one on the Rio Grande that's very, very close. It's like within a point. So it's either going to be 13 or 14 seats in Texas that voted for Joe Biden. When you look at a proportion, that means that Democrats are being given about a third of the seats in Texas. So they're being given about 33 to 34% of the seats in Texas in a state that they got 46% of the vote in. So when you're looking at that, you say, oh, well, then it's pretty clear that, Democrats are getting the short end of the stick in Texas. But the gap between 46 and 34, you're talking about 12 points to the right.
Mm-hmm.
So Illinois is 22 points to the left. In Texas, the most extreme Republican gerrymander, according to 538, is 12 points to the right. It is not even remotely close. As I said, in California, you've got the same thing. Republicans are getting 15% of the seats in a state that they got over 34% of the vote in. That's California's 19 points to the left.
So let's do this real quick because I can already tell. I already know somebody is watching this going, okay, dumbass, but you don't decide what all the lines look like just based off of the presidential outcomes. And
Totally
that's
true.
fair, right? That's fair. But that actually doesn't help their argument because the only way that you can get around this idea, one of the mechanisms that is used is they look at previous elections, especially things like statewide elections. So governor, attorney general, lieutenant governor, president. They look at all of these because it gives a good indication of where the state as a whole generally leans. Okay, so that is a fact. It's not the only factor, but it is a factor, and it's a relevant factor. Then they take into account the communities of interest, everything else, the dispersion of the votes around the state, in order to determine whether or not you can come up with congressional districts that accurately represent, the group that you have. And so go into that a little bit, just explain that
so
this isn't the only factor that's being used.
So the formula that I came up with only applies in certain circumstances, but it does apply in the states that really matter for redistricting: Texas, Ohio, Florida, New York,
Illinois.
California, Illinois.
This is a formula you put together.
Yeah. Like I said, that looks at the presidential results versus how many, proportionally speaking,
Sure.
how many seats you're getting.
I just find it impressive that you put together a formula to
I
factor
also
all
put
this in.
together a formula that, predicted the Virginia gubernatorial election within a,
Wow.
0.05% of the
That's
final
impressive.
outcome. So I geek out about this stuff, but I'm one of the few people on the right
Sure.
that cares about this stuff that's, on Twitter and stuff like that. Most of these people are on the left, and it's just infuriating seeing these bogus arguments from people like Wasserman. I actually tweeted at him. I'm like, are you joking, or are you like literally living in a cave right now to genuinely argue that, when a blue state gerrymanders, it gets thrown out by the courts, but when a red state gerrymanders, it gets upheld. First off, the red states can't gerrymander as effectively as the blue states, as I just demonstrated with Texas.
Yeah.
And more importantly, the blue states aren't being thrown out. It's just New York that got thrown out. Illinois is being upheld. California, they didn't even claim that was a blue gerrymander. Like people like Wasserman have the audacity to go out there and try to claim that a state like California wasn't gerrymandering when we just explained that Democrats rigged the process and put a Berkeley Republican that voted for Elizabeth Warren on the commission to represent the Republican side. But the formula that I worked up with has its limits. So like a good example of this is Massachusetts. Donald Trump got about a third of the vote in Massachusetts. So according to the formula, you would say, oh, well then, at least one seat in Massachusetts should be a Republican-leaning seat. The only way that you could draw a Republican-leaning seat in Massachusetts is actually if you gerrymander, because Republicans are so thinly spread throughout the state. And in Massachusetts, it's not just Boston that's blue, it's the whole state. Democrats live in the rural places just like they do in the cities. And so Democratic strength is evenly distributed throughout the entire state, which means that even if you tried, it would be very difficult to draw a Republican seat in Massachusetts. But the difference here is that there's no Republicans that are going out there, certainly I'm not, that is going out there saying Massachusetts must draw a Republican seat or else it's a Democrat gerrymander. I understand that you can't actually draw.
There's limitations.
There's limitations to it. Likewise, in Arkansas, the only way that you could draw a Democrat seat in Arkansas is if you actually gerrymandered and you drew the entire Mississippi River Delta in with Little Rock, and you drew like an L-shaped district in order to pack as many Democrats into one seat as possible. And if you didn't do that and you just drew 4 naturally held seats, you'd have 3 safe Republican seats and 1 lean Republican seat. And there's a good chance that Republicans would win 100% of the seats in Arkansas. Obviously, they didn't win 100% of the presidential vote in Arkansas in the last election. They probably won Arkansas about 2-1. So, like, there's limitations to this model because smaller states or states where the political geography is spread out across the whole entire state, it's very hard for you to draw seats that benefit the minority party. But in some of these other states like Illinois, New York, California, you absolutely can do that. And
Sure.
Democrats are intentionally going out of their way to maximize their redistricting advantage. And until the New York map was struck down, they were on track to actually win seats in the House of Representatives in terms of partisan lean. And now that court ruling in New York came in that took down this 4-22 gerrymander. So, as I said before, the party that won Donald Trump won 37% of the vote in New York in 2020.
We've got the map up now.
Yep. And yet his party was only going to be given 15% of the seats, which again, until the court struck down New York's map was tied with Illinois for the most egregious left-wing biased map of any of these large states.
When I look at this map with New York, I look at this and it doesn't look terribly gerrymandered compared to Illinois. Talk to us about how this is a gerrymander taking place here.
You've got a lot of packing going on.
Okay.
And packing is when you take voters that, vote for one block and you put them all in one district.
Take the mouse here and show us where that's taking place.
So a good example of packing is what's going on with this seat right here, the 24th district that loops around.
See how it loops around the 25th right there?
Yeah. And it's like the whole Great Lakes. These are all hardcore Republican areas. And so what that does is that if you were to draw these maps fairly, the 25th would still be a Democrat seat, but the 22nd wouldn't. The 25th I know would be because you've got like Buffalo and Rochester around here, and those are like very, very blue areas. But the 22nd here in Syracuse, the surrounding areas here are competitive. What the Democrats did originally with this map is that they took all these college towns like Ithaca and Syracuse, and they put them all together into one seat in order to make sure that this central New York district would be safe Democrat. Whereas if you were to say, draw the 22nd to be matching county lines, and you were to actually have it pick up some of these northern parts of New York State that's on the Great Lakes, the 22nd would be a toss-up district that Republicans could win. In fact, Republicans have previously won the districts. I don't think the district numbers were the same, but the district lines were very similar to this area, and Republicans have won seats around here before. Democrats decided to pack as many Republicans into this seat as possible, same thing with this one, in order to maximize their gains here, here, and here. And you've got another example of this down in Long Island. So Long Island is very politically competitive once you get out of New York City. What Democrats did is that they drew all of these blue parts of Nassau County in with the first district, and the edges of the first district near like East Hampton and whatnot are very, very blue. But the rest of this county right here is very, very red. So you have blue, red, blue. That's kind of like the trend when you get into eastern Long Island. And Democrats just skipped around the red parts in order to draw in 2 separate blue areas to maximize the number of seats that they got, whereas they packed as many Republicans as they could into the second district.
Sure.
And then they cracked Republican voters in the other ones by spreading them out across blue districts.
Question real quick. The number 2 district, it obviously leans more Republican than the others. Most all of the other Republican districts are in the northern part of the state.
Yeah, upstate New York.
Why is this second district lean more Republican?
So Long Island suburbs are politically divided. New York City is overwhelmingly Democrat, right? It's almost 70% Democrat. The Long Island suburbs, though, are more 50-50.
Okay.
So when you get into like Nassau and Suffolk County, which are out of New York City, but they're on Long Island, you keep going east, you've now gone into suburban territory that's basically 50-50 between the two.
Well, I think we've given everybody a good overview here, and I'd like to move us into the making the argument section. I know we briefly touched on this, but I want everybody that's listening to walk away with concise answers. So I want to ask the question again. Why can Democrats and Republicans not come together and just draw fair lines?
Oh my. Okay. So this is a lot like the question I hear, and I get it. But I sometimes I'll hear, why can't Republicans and Democrats just come together and do what's best for the people?
Yeah.
because the people don't agree on what's best for the people. Like other than like these large kind of grandiose ideas of we want everyone to be happy, healthy, prosperous, and free, right? Okay, everyone wants that.
Yeah.
How do you get that? Well, my solution is we want less government control. We want more free markets. We want more individual liberty. We want greater property rights. My colleagues on the other side who got voted into office just as much as I did think it's more government programs, more subsidization, higher taxes on certain people. So we disagree on what actually produces the best results for people. The same thing ends up being true when we talk about lines, right? What you are asking people to do is to draw up districts in such a way as to, allocate political power. And there's always going to be bias and incentive that goes into that people can rationally justify within their own mind. And no matter who you get, whether you call it an independent commission or not, it's not.
Sure.
Everyone shows up to the argument with some sort of bias, some sort of deeply held belief that this particular outcome is going to be the best one for these particular reasons. All you can do is come up with certain objective criteria that make sense across the board, right? That's that objective criteria that we all agree with. You shouldn't spend a bunch of precincts. You should keep communities of interest together. You shouldn't have, weird lines.
What do you mean by communities of interest?
So rural communities, urban communities is one of the most obvious kinds, right? So urban communities or suburban communities and rural communities are all dealing with different issues.
Sure.
And so they want those issues to be represented, whether it's at the state government or whether it's at the federal government. So, inner city Richmond, it is not really concerned about, agricultural law, right? On some level, like it affects them, right? But that's not, they're more concerned about what's going on in the city.
A good example of a community of interest would be Portsmouth and Norfolk in Hampton Roads, like keeping them together in a congressional seat because they border each other. They're very similar. They're both cities. They're both on the water. They both have similar economies.
Industries. Yeah, similar industries that are going to be affected.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and they want that represented. So that's the sort of thing when we talk about communities of interest, that's what we're talking about. Like the sort of legislation that's going to be carried and the votes that are going to be taking are going to represent the concerns of a majority or significant majority of the people within that particular district. Right? So that's all the stuff that we agree on.
Sure.
The real question then becomes okay, create some sort of structure where these rules are in place, have people draw lines, understanding that there's going to be competing interests and bias involved, right? Then you can also have something like where the courts can come in and say, no, these are the rules, and this particular line right here is a violation of these rules. So you can come up with multiple levels of, separation of powers and oversight to where you can get to the fairest portion possible. And that is something I think most people want, but it becomes really, really easy politically for one side, whoever it is, right, to manipulate this process by saying, well, all we want is an independent commission and they won't let us because they want power.
Or they're racist.
Or they're racist.
That's actually my next question is I think Republicans a lot of the time get charged with this, decree of racism when we gerrymander or anything of that nature. Why is it that it's the left always accusing us of that in this situation?
Well, it's interesting because the whole reason why we had to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Oh, and by the way, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution was because of Democrat policies.
Right.
Right. It was either slavery, it was Jim Crow laws in the Democrat controlled South. But now, because minorities, depending on the minority groups, it's actually different. And
I wouldn't even say now. I'd say historically, minorities.
Right? But because especially Black Americans were disenfranchised in the law, they were legitimately disenfranchised. We had to pass laws which essentially said you can't disenfranchise them anymore. Well, originally it was get rid of slavery and let at that time it was let Black men vote. Right. That's what happened in the 1860s. Well, what ended up happening is because states control the processes, they came up with things like, poll taxes or
poll literacy tests.
Yeah. So they would come up with ridiculous questions so that when a Black citizen came in to vote, they'd ask him some weird question that had no correct answer and then say, oh, you failed the poll test. You don't get to vote. You failed the literacy, or you can't afford to vote because you're poor. Right. So that's where the Civil Rights Act came in. And the Voting Rights Act came in and said, no, you can't do that. It's a violation of their civil liberties. Well, now another part of that was how you drew the lines, because another way that racist, usually Democrats, would draw the lines would be to say okay, fine, then what we're going to do is we're going to split up the Black vote among so many congressional districts, because they largely live in urban areas, that we're going to do that in such a way to where there's no such thing as a majority black district. And so essentially it was destroying that community of interest, especially in the South.
You got that a lot in like cities,
Yeah.
like Atlanta at the like early 1900s, Richmond as well. When you had some of these cities, when black voters started moving into them, white Democrat politicians in like the 50s and 60s then started changing the election rules in order to make sure that like the city council would still be all white Democrats. And that's carried, and that was like in local elections, that's carried over into federal elections. But the argument that the left makes now of, oh, well, Republicans are being racist when they draw lines. No, Republicans are doing the exact same thing that Democrats are doing, which is they're trying to maximize the number of Republican seats. The problem is that Republicans aren't doing it politically. I'm not saying morally. The problem politically is that Republicans aren't doing it as effectively as Democrats are.
Okay.
I just demonstrated how Texas, the Republican gerrymander, is less effective than the Democrat gerrymander in the supposedly neutral state of California.
Right.
And in Florida, the new boogeyman state that the Democrats are railing about, they're complaining about how the 5th district in Florida, which used to be from Jacksonville to Tallahassee, and it wasn't a VRA district, but Democrats like to argue that it was, even though it wasn't.
That's a voting right. VRA is Voting Rights Act.
And Democrats, when Republicans split up Tallahassee and Jacksonville and had Tallahassee be in the 2nd district, which is kind of the panhandle, and Jacksonville stay in the 4th and 5th, which is the Atlantic coast of northeast Florida, Democrats pitched a fit and was like, this is racism. The problem is that you're talking about two areas that are split between the two of them by like 200 miles. And the only thing that's in common between the two of them is that Jacksonville votes Democrat and Tallahassee votes Democrat, and everything in between votes Republican. And we're going to connect the two together and then say, whoa, that's a VRA district. And if you have any objections to it, you're a racist for breaking it up. This is at the same time that Republicans took the 14th district, which is Tampa, and they drew it in to the southern part of Pinellas County, which has a bunch of black voters in southern St. Petersburg. And so now the 14th is actually a black opportunity district. It's still a Democrat district, and that's the only reason that Democrats don't care about it, is because the 14th used to be a Democrat district. So it doesn't matter that there's now more black voters in the 14th, and black voters in the 14th can actually elect a representative of their choosing in this district. Democrats don't care about that because it was already a Democrat-held district.
And this is also, and again, I think what Christian's getting to right here as well is that it's the motivation behind the gerrymander. Right? There used to be a very legitimate motivation, or I'm sorry, it wasn't a legitimate motivation. It was a legitimate concern that the motivation for gerrymanders taking place within the Democrat South was specifically designed to disenfranchise black voters. All right, what you're seeing in some of the gerrymanders now across the country is a fight between
partisanship.
It's partisanship. It's not because I'm sorry, I just don't see the evidence for it, at least where I'm sitting, where Republicans are like, oh, no, we're targeting this particular demographic.
Sure.
No, what it is both parties are targeting voting groups, and it turns out that most high-density urban areas, like cities, tend to vote more Democrat. And there's actually some practical and philosophical reasons for that are fascinating, but that's for a different time. But again, this idea that
To blow up the whole entire racial gerrymandering argument, here's a really good example of this. So in Texas, South Texas, Republicans made massive gains in 2020. Donald Trump went from having Republicans being absolutely blown out of the water in the Rio Grande Valley to actually winning some of the counties in South Texas that hadn't voted for a Republican in something like 100 years. And Hidalgo County ended up voting something like 40% for Trump, which is like before Republicans were like lucky to get like 30%. And so South Texas Hispanics like zoomed to the right. I mean, they went like literally like 30 to 40 points to the right from previous elections, which means that South Texas is now not quite 50-50, but it is pretty close. It's like 55-45 Democrat Republican now down in South Texas, whereas it used to be like almost 70-30 Democrat Republican. And so when Republicans redrew the congressional lines in South Texas, they actually didn't do, so like usually Democrats say that you're taking minority voters and you're spreading them out across a bunch of land in order to dilute their vote, and you're being racist by doing that. Well, Republicans kept Hispanic voters in South Texas in similar districts because they think they're going to flip those districts.
Right.
And so like, South Texas Hispanics went from being a safe Democrat constituency to being a competitive swing voting block. And so when Republicans redrew the congressional lines, they kept some of these South Texas seats together. And like some of these districts you're talking are like 60+% Hispanic, majority Hispanic, absolute majority Hispanic. And Republicans didn't try to pack white voters in there to dilute the voting strength of the Hispanics. Republicans drew the maps. The way that they did, they just drew in the Hispanic Republican areas in order to try to flip these districts. And so like there's 2 seats in South Texas now that could flip in November and elect Hispanic Republicans to Congress because they're zooming to the right.
Yeah, that's the answer. I mean, again, if you're looking at this from a historical perspective and you're saying, oh my gosh, this used to be incredibly prevalent and advertised, right? It's not like white Southern Democrats were hiding the fact that they were trying to disenfranchise the black vote. They were absolutely trying to do it. So like there's this plausibility to the overall argument that Democrats are making that when when this gerrymandering takes place, oh, it must be for this reason. But it's like, no, it's not.
You're posturing.
Yeah, you're posturing. You're trying to make this about race when that's not. Now, that's not to say that you can't be mad about a gerrymander, right? You can be mad about a gerrymander. But they want to make it a racial component because they want it to not only be, wrong from a representation standpoint, they want it to be evil motivations and intentions, whereas they would never do something like that, right? So,
and it's stronger to argue.
So even when they gerrymander, it's because they're trying to take care of
for
marginalized communities, right? They're trying to take care of vulnerable. So that's why, again, it ends up adding in a moral component, which I don't think is really at the root of what's going on with the gerrymandering that you see.
The last question I had was on packing and cracking, but I think we went over that pretty well in this episode. So, Christian, how would you feel about making the argument for us on this today?
Oh, boy. Well, this will be interesting.
Give us your main talking points.
If you walk away with anything from what we've discussed today, it's a couple things. Both parties gerrymander. There's no question about it. You can look at Ohio, you can look at North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. Republicans gerrymander. You can look at California, Illinois, and New York, and other states like New Jersey, and you can say that Democrats gerrymander. Both parties do it. Gerrymandering is an inherent part of the political process. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing. I'm not defending the act of it from a moral standpoint. I'm simply pointing out that both parties do it. When you see news articles like 538s that try to say that Republicans are either being racist doing it or that Republicans are doing it more egregiously or being more evil, and they're active gerrymandering than Democrats, there's some simple mathematical formulas that you can run in order to demonstrate that that is patently false. In Texas and in Florida, the 2 supposedly most extreme Republican gerrymanders in the entire country, they are less extreme than the Democrat gerrymanders in the supposedly neutral state of California. And that leads me to my second point. When Democrats try to say that the way that we solve gerrymandering is through independent, nonpartisan commissions, you should be asking them who gets to appoint who's on the commission, because the members of the commission matters more than anything else. And if you say that we're going to have a nonpartisan commission, but it's only Democrats that get to select who's on the commission, there's going to be a problem. And if you allow the commission process to just say that I'm going to switch my party registration, even though I voted for Elizabeth Warren and I live in Berkeley, but I'm now going to identify as a Republican, there's another problem with that as well. At the end of the day, the people that are most invested in this process, this very deeply complex process of redistricting, are the exact same people that have every motivation in the world to gerrymander in favor of their side. So the solution to gerrymandering is not to pass a federal takeover of elections through H.R. 1, and it's not to pass fake, supposedly independent commissions that aren't actually independent. The solution to gerrymandering is to enshrine certain legal protections that create a left and right boundary of what you can do when you're drawing lines. You should be drawing lines that respect existing political boundaries. Keep cities together. Keep counties together where you can. Don't split precincts. You should be respecting geographic boundaries. You shouldn't be drawing districts that are overlapping across mountain chains or through giant rivers or lakes unless you absolutely need to. And the last thing that we should be doing when we're drawing district lines are we should be keeping communities together that share common interests, that either have similar jobs or tied into the same industry or share a similar culture or history. If you have a Hispanic community in Chicago, you should be keeping that community together rather than drawing them in with, white voters that live in the loop. If you have a black community in Atlanta, you should be drawing them in together rather than trying to draw in, white Republican parts of Appalachia. If you have Asian voters in Orange County, you should be drawing them in together rather than trying to split their voting power up amongst different groups. But it's not just by race, it's also by culture. For example, Orange and Culpeper, here where we live, have had a shared history for so long that we should be keeping those counties together when we're drawing congressional lines. As long as you're keeping communities of interest that are either based on economics or a shared history together, and you're respecting geographic boundaries like lakes, rivers, and counties, and you're not crossing county lines or cities unless you absolutely need to, you're probably going to end up coming up with a map that isn't going to please everybody, but is going to be much fairer than if you just draw lines like the ones that we've seen in Illinois or New York.
That was great, Christian.
Dang,
Nick,
that was solid.
That was very solid. But Nick, I wonder who we could follow on Twitter if we wanted to get more information and stay up to date on the redistricting issue.
Definitely Dave Wasserman. No, I'm just kidding.
That guy right over there.
I don't know. Maybe it's this guy right here.
That guy right there. No,
Christian
I'm
Hines.
dead serious. I mean, Christian's fought us on this for a while now. On I don't want you to push all of my stuff out. Look, the bottom line is that when you were looking at politics in general. And because, again, Christian said something in his explanation that I'm gonna tell you right now. There was the one part I disagreed with. And he's like, you can run some simple mathematical equations. I don't know about you. I'm not doing that.
Nope.
I'm not doing that. But I know somebody who has. And it's this guy right here. So he really has done some great work. The analysis he runs, the models that he runs. So if you're looking to follow what's going on with redistricting, if you're looking to follow what's going on with election predictions and various races to watch, I'd highly recommend Christian's Twitter. But give me your Twitter handle, Christian.
At Christian Hines. It's not the way that you might think it's spelled, though. The last name is Heiens.
So just stack all them
I
vowels
know,
together.
3 vowels in a row. So it's Christian. It's at Christian.
We're gonna put it in the
Heiens.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes.
We're going to put it in the show notes as well. And I end up retweeting a lot of Christian stuff as well because, again, I don't got time to come up with the mathematical formulas. And if I did, I wouldn't spend my time coming up with mathematical formulas.
To be fair, though, that goes back to the heart of everything that we were just talking about. The average voter does not have the time.
No.
To their credit, I'm not saying that they're wrong for not pouring over hours of doing this. People have better things to do with their lives than to care about this sort of stuff or pay attention to this 24/7.
They care about the results of it. They care about the results of it. But again, it's not their specialty. And one of the most frustrating things, this is why, I mean,
and everybody on the left focusing on it or everybody that's focusing on this on Twitter, with the exception of just a handful of people, are all on the left.
The left, right? And this is the problem that we've had in places. This is the problem that anybody that is liberty-minded, conservative, we go into the culture, we look for analysis, we try to look for good, objective reporting on things, and we constantly feel betrayed that like we're being manipulated.
Yep.
And we want to find more people that we trust that is going to give us accurate information, and we know where it's coming from, right? We know Christian is coming from a liberty conservative perspective.
And is brutally honest.
Yeah, but is brutally honest with you. And like he said like 4 different times a day, they gerrymandered in Florida. They gerrymandered in Texas. He's not denying that, right? He's not trying to give, Republicans a pass. But he's also trying to, let's be intellectually honest about what's going on. And one of the most important things he's doing is he's giving you the criteria by which he's judging these things, right? Yep. Because that's not what 538 is doing half the time.
No, they're using a criteria. They're saying, how many blue seats are we getting?
Yeah, they're not using, I'm not saying they're not using a criteria. I'm saying they're not being honest about the criteria that they're using in their analysis. That's why one article is, this is the worst gerrymandering, most extreme.
Yeah.
And the other
New York might change the partisan
this
makeup.
might change some stuff, right? A couple seats might change. Golly, right? So, again, if you're looking for analysis that you can trust, I would highly recommend you go on, follow his Twitter account, follow ours as well, because, again, we also link to it. But that'll give you some of the information you need to stay informed on an issue that you care about, but also being able to rely on somebody else that's actually spending the time to do the analysis. Because, again, I'm not doing math problems on this. I'm sorry.
Well, I can say that I've definitely come out of this conversation understanding a lot more about all of this, and I appreciate you answering my questions, Christian and Nick. It's an important issue.
It is. It only happens once a decade. I mean,
well, and it's it'd be frustrating for me to be get involved in a certain congressional district, and then the redistricting
redraw the
happens,
lines
and they
and,
redraw the lines.
yeah.
I'm in a different congressional district.
I mean, that's going to happen in a lot of states. Like it's going to be really interesting to see how the November elections play out, because
Sure.
you're going to have places that have never elected a Republican before or haven't in decades that are probably going to do so, in part because of redistricting, but also because the national environment. And I'm sure that we'll probably talk more about that as we actually get closer to November. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this episode of Making the Argument, and we will see you next time.
All right.